and unmuting lines. When Amanda unmutes your line and lets you know it's your turn, please state your first and last name just as you would in our in-person meetings. Indicate the topic you're speaking on and the 2-minute timer will begin. At the 2-minute mark, we will announce time and your microphone will be muted. We will now open our general comment period. Amanda, please start with our first comment.
Sure thing. First, we have Patrick Talley. Patrick, go ahead.
Oh, hey, I'm Patrick. Hopefully you can hear me all right.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess my comments about the Livable City initiative. It seems, based off like what I saw from the 300 West planning, there's very little importance put on like dedicated bus lanes and stuff like that, and I feel that should be necessity. There's so much research about how cities are only as like efficient as their bus lines for the most part, or like their public transit. And the idea is like if our buses are stuck in traffic, then what's the point of you ever using a bus? And that's going to like have so many downstream effects about just overall traffic and just everything else. So I feel like that should be more important. Maybe I just missed it, and if so, I'm sorry. And I guess the other thing is, it seems that there's also like on that initiative and stuff like that, I guess I just want to like maybe bring to your attention like the idea of points of conflict. So like on that road, it's still really, really car centric. It feels like where there's going to be a lot of points of conflict about like, okay, cars coming in and stuff like that. So I just feels, I don't know. I know like Strong Towns has a lot of stuff about that. How you should be like kind of focusing more on having streets and like having roads instead of like trying like to intermingle them, which is a more American type concept versus like more Netherlands style concept. So sorry, it was a little bit rambly, but I just kind of wanted to have that as a comment.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. I don't see other names for general comment.
All right. Thank you to everyone who provided general comment. Was one gentleman. Are there any comments? And you said nobody else is out there. So we are now at the public hearing portion of our agenda. We only have one public hearing, item B1, RDA budget amendment number 1 for fiscal year 2020-21. Do we have any comments for this item? And the same rules of decorum that I earlier explained also applies to our public hearing portion of the board's agenda.
RDA Chair, we do not have any comments for this public hearing.
Great. Thank you so much. Before we move on to item 1 of our agenda, I wanted to welcome our newest board member, Dennis Fares. Welcome to an exciting meeting today to hear about budget for the most part and a little bit of housing priorities. So we're excited to have you, Dennis. All right.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. We are on item number 1, resolution, which is the RDA budget amendment number 1 for fiscal year 2020-21. So basically the one that it's about to end.
Sorry,
So
Madam Chair, I
Yes.
think that there's a resolution to meet without an anchor location, to meet electronically.
Oh.
Is that not on your version?
It's not.
Okay, sorry, that must not, we had to amend the agenda late last week and maybe that didn't make it into the script version, but
Right.
there is a resolution for the board to consider, which permits the Redevelopment Agency Board of Directors to meet electronically pursuant to the Utah Open and Public Meetings Act.
Great. And
so we would need the board to adopt that resolution.
with a motion, correct?
Yes.
Great. Do I have a motion?
Madam Chair,
Go ahead.
I move that the board adopt a resolution which permits the Redevelopment Agency Board of Directors and the Redevelopment Advisory Committee to meet electronically pursuant to the Utah Open and Public Meetings Act.
Second.
We have a motion by Board Member Mano and a second by Board Member Dugan. I'm going to roll call. Councilmember Rogers, Board Member Rogers,
Yes.
Board Member Ferris,
Yes.
Board Member Wharton,
Yes.
Board Member Mano,
Yes.
Board Member Dugan,
Yes.
Board Member Fowler. Board Member Fowler is currently absent, and I'm a yes, so the motion passes. Now we're moving on to item number 2 in this case, resolution RDA budget amendment number 1 for fiscal year 2020-21. And do we have any comments on this, Amanda, from the public?
So you already held a public hearing on this one. So this is just the discussion of the board on this item.
I'm so sorry. Why is this off? Why is my agenda off here?
This is just the discussion part.
All right. We're moving
And
on.
we'll have Ben Ledke on our staff
Danny.
and Danny.
I apologize for that. Go ahead, Ben.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Each year, the RDA board receives a budget amendment to adjust the annual budget based on actual tax increment received. The budget amendment before you today contains the true-up adjustments based on actual tax increment. Most of the items in this amendment are legal requirements for the RDA. For example, several items are taxing entity payments, which is a pass-through to the school district or Salt Lake County. There are also tax increment reimbursements to properties that have agreements with the RDA. If certain conditions are fulfilled that advance project area objectives, then a portion of their property tax increment is reimbursed. This is called post-performance because the tax reimbursement is only provided after the conditions of the agreement have been met. Another legal requirement for some project areas is setting aside a percentage of tax increment for affordable housing. There are several items in this budget amendment that are not legal requirements, which I'll quickly summarize, and please jump in if board members have any questions. The first of these items is a request for $568,000 in additional funding for the Central Business District Commercial Development Loan Program. If approved, the new total for the loan program would be $818,000. Funding in this loan program does not lapse to fund balance at the end of the fiscal year. There are currently no applications in the pipeline for these funds. The administration is working on potential revisions to the loan guidelines that would require board approval. So you may see this loan program come back to you next fiscal year. Next is a request for $594,000 in additional funding for the Eccles Theater Debt Service Reserve Fund. If approved, the reserve fund would have a balance of $2.1 million. Now, the reserve fund was created and is needed to cover a $7.5 million projected shortfall between revenues and bond payments. The agency is working with the finance department to update the projections and determine how large that reserve should be in future years. The next item is a request for $959,000 in additional funding for station center infrastructure. This is in the Depot District. Note that there is another request for funding of station center infrastructure, $332,000 in the fiscal year 22 annual budget. If both of those requests are approved, then station center infrastructure would have a budget of $11.1 million. This has accrued over several years, and it's in a capital account, so it doesn't fall to fund balance at the end of the fiscal year. Even with the $11.1 million, there is still a projected funding gap of $3 million to $5 million. Based on the current designs for Station Center, the total cost estimate is $14 million to $16 million. The next item is a request for $288,000 for a new program in the Granary District called Community and Cultural Initiatives. This is another item where there is a request in the annual budget also for this new program. The annual budget request is $443,000. As a new program, the funding would be put into a holding account, and the agency staff would come back to the board with proposed criteria and a process for how to use the funds. The next item is a request for $144,000 in additional funding for a catalytic development on the North Temple corridor. The annual budget is also requesting additional funding for this in the amount of $289,000. If both of those requests are approved, and in recent years there were additional appropriations for a catalytic development on the North Temple corridor, the total balance available would be almost $1.3 million. Next up is a request for $176,000 for project area seed funds. These are made available to the two newest project areas, 9 Line and State Street. There is a total of $2.1 million, assuming this additional amount is approved. But of that $2.1 million, $750,000 is pending reimbursement. The agency fronted the $750,000 to fund the new track station at 650 South Main Street, and adjacent developments are reimbursing the agency, but the exact timing of those reimbursements is not known. There are several minor adjustments of funding sources for the agency's administrative budget. This covers things such as personal services, staff salaries. So with that overview of the non-legal requirement items, are there any questions? If not, that was everything I had prepared.
Madam Chair,
Board Member Mano.
I'm just looking through the staff report. I don't see any of those things you just listed. Am I reading the wrong thing, or I'm confused?
There is no staff report on this item.
We received it in the middle of our budget process. And so if you go through the administration's transmittal, those projects are all listed. What Ben was able to do is pull out from the administration's transmittal which things are not legally required for the board to adopt as part of a budget amendment. So there are some things like tax increment reimbursements that where we already have a contract with a developer, for example, to reimburse tax increment, that's contractually required. And then there are other things like funding for those new programs that the board could take it under advisement and act or not act if you feel like it. One other thing I wanted to clarify was just the timeline on this is that this is the work session item for this. We've already had the public hearing and the board could consider adoption at a June 1 or June 8 meeting.
Thank you. Did I answer your question, Board Member Mano? A little bit.
I think so. I think I'm just having trouble reading the transmittal, but that's okay.
I was trying to follow as well what Ben was saying. I was able to find some of those numbers, Ben, in the transmittal that we have from the administration. However, Ben, is it possible, did you send us an email with this information that you presented today? Or is it possible that you could send it to us so that we can compare with the document that we have?
Yeah, I can definitely send you a summary of my verbal remarks. I'll work on that next.
That would be great. Thank you so much. Oh, and then I had another question. You said for the depot district, that there was with a combination with city funds, it was about $11 million of funds set aside for infrastructure in that area.
That's correct. 11.1 million for Station Center, which is inside of the depot district. This is a project that is envisioned as building 3 new streets, reconstructing a current street, as well as several upgrades to the streetscape and utilities.
Okay.
And it wouldn't fully fund the project. There's still a $3 million, $5 million gap.
Deficit. Okay.
It's only infrastructure, correct, Ben? It has nothing to do with any projects. It's all about building the infrastructure up in Station Center.
Correct. It's all in the public right of way.
And do we have details already for which streets?
Yeah, I can include the RDA in a recent transmittal included a really handy map that shows the different parcels as well as the locations of the proposed new streets. So I'll include that in the email to the full board.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Anybody else have any questions, or can we have Danny next? We're good? All right. Danny, is that something, did you have something to add?
Sorry, Madam Chair, I was assuming we were waiting to see if board members had any questions for Ben. Thank you. Thanks, Ben, for teeing that up. That pretty much covers everything in our transmittal, so I'm happy to answer any additional questions from the board at this time.
All right, board members, you have questions for Ben?
Madam Chair,
Yes, go ahead.
I noticed on the way I was reading this that the tax increment seemed to be higher than the budget. Was that based on just a good year, or do we see that going forward also? Or did I read that, or am I reading it wrong?
No, you were reading that correct. This is, as Ben said, this is essentially just a truing up of the actual dollar amounts we received in tax increment. And we were fortunate that pretty much all of our funds, we received more increment than what we originally projected in the original budget. That's primarily a function also of we have tended to be in the last few years fairly conservative in our budget projections. And obviously we'll speak to that in a few minutes when we talk about next year's budget. But we figure that it's usually best to be conservative and then be in the position we're in today to allocate additional funds that we realize rather than have to deal with a shortfall.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else? So I have a question then, Danny. So so that I understand it, we had the current budget, we got additional funds, we're going to amend that budget, but are we moving it towards the 21-22 budget, or is it going to, like, if we, I mean, because it's pretty much at the end, right, of the 2021 budget. So are we moving these funds to the 21-22, or how is it going to work out?
No, we are handling it within the current fiscal year. And the reason for that is primarily because, as Ben described, there are several allocations that we have to do because we are statutorily obligated and or obligated by interlocal agreements with either taxing entities or reimbursement agreements with property owners. So this is a truing up within the current fiscal year and making sure that we're doing the correct allocations within that fiscal year prior to anything rolling over to fiscal year 22.
Okay.
I would just add, Madam Chair,
Yes, go ahead.
the items I reviewed in more detail are not legally required. So if the board wanted more time on any or all of them, you do not have to adopt them this fiscal year.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Any other questions? see anybody. Nope, I don't see James. I don't see that. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. We are moving on to item number 3, which is the overview of the redevelopment agency budget for fiscal year 21-22. So next year, which is coming up. At the table, we have Jennifer Bruno from our council. She's the deputy director, Ben, Danny, and Tammy. Go ahead, Jen.
I'll actually turn it over to Tammy and Danny, who I think have an overview for you guys.
We do. Thanks, Jen, and thanks again, Madam Chair. As we pull up that presentation, let me also welcome new board member Ferris. I don't know if you could have picked a worse meeting to start on or a worse time of year in budget, but I'm sure you've already heard that from everyone, so I will just apologize in advance. But we are pleased today to come before your board and present our fiscal year 22 budget. As part of this presentation, Tammy and I will go through it together, and then obviously at any point, if board members have questions, please don't hesitate to stop us. So Tammy, if you want to hit the next slide, I'll go through kind of what the contents are. We wanted to start with just a few highlights from fiscal year 21. We did provide a year-end review to the board a couple months ago, but we wanted to kind of update that and provide a few of the higher level projects that we've completed within the current fiscal year. Then we wanted to speak to what our priorities are for fiscal year 22, as well as provide the description for some of the new programs that we're proposing. And then we'll get into the really interesting numbers and charts and graphs of the budget breakdown of some of the items that we typically provide tracking and metrics on. And then finally, we'll go through the high level key changes that are within each fund within the budget. So next slide, please, Tammy. I think we'll start off right away with Tammy going through and starting us with some of the highlights.
Great, thank you, Danny. These next 2 slides are a few of our housing project highlights, either groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings, or loan approvals. The first you're probably familiar with. It's at about 1750 South State Street, the redevelopment of the former Capitol Motel site. We're partnering with the Housing Authority of Salt Lake City on that. They're leading that project. The Housing Authority also this year, or this fiscal year, opened Pamela's Place, which is a great project that's providing 100 units to formerly homeless individuals or individuals at risk of homelessness on 5th West and 525 South. The last little box down there are 3 recently approved loans, including 144 Place Apartments, Wasatch Community Gardens, and the Colony B loan that I believe you actually approved in the last RDA meeting. Moving on to additional housing projects, the Jackson loan closure and groundbreaking occurred in this fiscal year. This is a great project. It was actually expiring, the term of affordability was expiring. So a developer came in and purchased the property, re-upped that term of affordability, so those lower income individuals would not be displaced from the project. And they're doing a historically significant or sensitive rehab, I should say, on the project. The Maya, the first building of the Maya, which is part of the Exchange development, the Barnes Bank redevelopment, opened, which is exciting. There are 80 affordable micro units in that building. And of course, our 255 State Street there on State Street broke ground. So in total, the projects I've discussed on these last 2 slides will provide 610 units of affordable housing, and then additional market rate units in the community.
On more of the commercial and programmatic side, the agency provided a $3.1 million primary financing loan for the renovation and adaptive reuse of a commercial space on 900 South. This is one of our first projects in the 9-line project area. They are wrapping up that construction and looking to start leasing that space. You'll recall that shortly after the pandemic hit, the agency also put out a public art commission where we worked with 33 Utah artists to do the Art for Hope project that was installed on several RDA properties throughout the city. And this was in response to, as part of the pandemic, art galleries closing and limited opportunities for artists to display their work and having a hit on their income potential. And then importantly, we wrapped up the final stages of approving the 9-line community reinvestment area, which has been now formally adopted by both the city, the school district, and the county through interlocal agreements with the agency. And we have finalized all the last pieces to start officially working in that area. And then more recently, the board received the presentation on the wrap-up of the Japantown design strategy, which culminated a 15-month process with the neighborhood and stakeholders in their visioning for the area. You'll recall that it resulted in a design strategy that was multi-phase that could take place over time and provided cost ranges so that the community can continue to look at how they can implement that over time and also seek additional funding and partners. We continue to work on the Folsom Corridor and more specifically the City Creek daylighting feasibility study. We have received direction to move forward with the partial creek flow option, but we're also working with Seven Canyons Trust to put out an RFP to design a master plan for how to better integrate that flow option into the overall trail corridor. And also recently was the Spy Hop building dedication and opening, where the agency provided both assistance with the acquisition of the land as well as funding for the construction of the project itself. This is one of the final pieces in the Central 9th neighborhood, and an anchor that was specifically targeted for community nonprofit use to create activation within the area.
Moving on to housing policies. As you know, the RDA board recently adopted the Housing Development Loan Program policy and the Housing Allocation Funds policy. And this is several years of work to kind of create that streamlined process and the one-stop shop for affordable housing developers to access funding. The board also adopted amendments to the real property disposition policy. These amendments authorize long-term ground leases as a form of land disposition, and also added a restriction on disposition in regards to exclusively negotiating with adjacent property owners. The board also adopted a public arts policy. We had a very vague policy that was several years old, so this policy clarifies public or RDA funds for public art projects and publicly visible art projects, and increased that investment to 1.5% for capital infrastructure projects dedicated to art.
Looking ahead to fiscal year 22 budget, yes, Madam Chair.
Yes, I would. So I forgot to mention one thing, and I appreciate the highlights of 2021 to start this meeting off. And now we're going to get into the big stuff for the next year. But because of time and we have a closed session later today, we're going to combine this item number 3 with item number 4, which is the affordable housing funding priorities, the follow-up that we had from last time. So board members, be thinking as well about those priorities that you've been having in mind as you hear this presentation, and then we can have a discussion about it once again. Sorry about that, Danny. Please go ahead.
No, I appreciate you saying that. That's a great point, because as we get into these slides a little bit more, you'll notice that Tammy gets into a little bit more detail on the housing side, and that's to do exactly that, to touch on those priorities and combine those conversations, and then be able to address any questions or concerns that the board has. So thanks. And it's a great segue to now getting into next year's budget, starting with the priority projects. These are current agency projects and programs that, as part of the next year's annual budget, we are proposing allocations to help. We talked a little bit about Station Center, both within the context of the proposed funding within Budget Amendment 1, as well as additional funding proposed in fiscal year 22. This, as we stated, is for not just the infrastructure within Station Center, but you'll recall that in prior allocations, the board has indicated that those funds could be used both for the infrastructure as well as site costs related to existing agency property and buildings, and also some of the final land acquisition contracts that we're in as well right now. So that would be that allocation. And then also continue to provide funds for the North Temple Catalytic Project. These funds, as the board has directed us, to focus on both property acquisition, loan incentives and programs, as well as potential infrastructure improvements in the North Temple area. And then finally, as Tammy mentioned, rolling out the housing development loan program as a function of the policies that the board has approved, allocating funds that continue to put these resources out on the street for affordable housing projects.
Looking at funding requests for new programs, keep in mind that these new programs and initiatives would be placed, funding allocated to these programs would be placed into a holding account, and RDA staff would bring forward policies and procedures for the board's consideration at a later date. The first program we're contemplating is a storefront and commercial revitalization program. And this is really looking at revising our commercial loans to target smaller local businesses, really targeting impact in specific project areas and being more flexible with our funding. We're also proposing a sustainability technical assistance program. And this is really with the mayor's direction to heighten our sustainability standards. This program would provide funding to assist developers with implementing these heightened standards. So it would be like technical assistance, essentially. We are also proposing a cultural community initiative program. And this program is contemplated to support public arts and cultural programs. And it's really intended to be an anti-gentrification and displacement measure, keeping those smaller grassroots creative organizations within neighborhoods that they could potentially become priced out of.
Okay, now we get into the real interesting charts and graphs and metrics that we like to highlight for the board's information as you consider the budget for next year. This first one are the trends of our tax increment revenue as we receive it. Director Dugan, this ties in directly with your question earlier of how we make the projections for the tax increment and why we end up with budget amendments to true that up. You'll see that the darker blue or turquoise bars are the actual revenues that we receive, and what we highlight for 2020 and 2021 look like that we are actually receiving less revenue. This is simply because as part of our budget, the numbers we project within the actual budgets, we are fairly conservative year over year. And then what we actually realize in terms of revenue is often greater than what we've projected. And this is simply just a safety measure we build in as part of being conservative so that we know that we're budgeting what we more securely anticipate receiving, and then we have that truing up as part of the budget amendment. So this doesn't necessarily represent an anticipated drop in revenue as much as just how we are reflecting that within the proposed budgets. In 2020, even though we've just presented budget amendment 1, we are still showing what the original budget dollar amount was, not necessarily what we've actually received yet. So next slide, please. And then this is a summary of our overall revenue budget. And we like to present this so that the board has a greater understanding of kind of how we realize revenue within the agency. So I like to start on the far right side of this graph. And as you look at our budget, you'll note that our total budget is just under $58 million. However, the bar immediately to the left of that, you first have to realize that over 10 million of that is just transfers within our own internal fund. It's not necessarily true revenue as much as just us as we receive money, then moving it around to the different fund transfers. So taking that and jumping now over to the far left, that basically starts with $37 million of tax increment that we receive. And again, these are our projected revenues. So tax increment is the major source of revenue for the agency. We also realize or project just under $2 million in interest within our funds. And that's a combination of obviously us holding the funds, not just within the current fiscal year, but on a lot of our capital projects that we hold year over year that generate interest. Within that revenue, we also technically receive 4.1 million in additional taxing entity payments as a function of the CBD project area and Block 70, as far as what we have agreed to reimburse back to them and then what they have agreed to let us hold on to as part of the Eccles project. Internally, we also realized over 1.4 million in revenue from parking structures, our rental properties, and items like that. We received just under 2.6 million from the city as part of the Funding Our Future program. And then we have 384,000 in miscellaneous income. So in total, our new revenue projected for fiscal year 2022 is $47.6 million. And then taking that 47.6 on the expenditure side, how it plays out is the first thing we have to do is, as a function of several of our project areas and extensions, we have to turn around and directly rebate back to the taxing entities just over $17.1 million. So it's a case where we receive the increment, and as part of our negotiations with the entities and the interlocal agreements, they are entitled for us to rebate back to them a portion of that. We also have just over 3.8 million in contractual obligations with developers and property owners for reimbursement agreements. And as Ben indicated in our earlier presentation, these are post-performance payments that are based on agreements that we've negotiated that if they build the project and it generates the increment as proposed, then they are entitled to a reimbursement of a portion of their tax increment. And then we have just over $11 million in obligated debt service, and this is primarily for Eccles Theater and the Regent Street project. From there, we have just over 7.8 million, and this includes everything from our administration costs to our overall operations and maintenance and services that we pay for. And what that does is, starting with the 47.6 million that we receive in revenue, that leaves just over 7.7 million for actual projects and allocation towards things that we as the agency then, and you as the board, have the opportunity to decide how to spend.
So of that 7.75 million, this chart demonstrates how the RDA administration is proposing on allocating that discretionary funding for projects. About 61% of that allocation we're proposing for various housing activities, 19% for commercial and mixed use. And then we have 8% for infrastructure, 7% for loans, and 5% for environment and sustainability. Most of these specific programs listed here have been mentioned on previous slides, so I won't get into them, but I will on the next slide get a little bit into housing. And Madam Chair, based on your request to combine these two agenda items, I'll take a little bit of a deeper dive here. New for this fiscal year, and based on two housing policies that you recently adopted, last time the RDA talked about a funding strategy and specifically funding priorities that we transmitted to the board. This strategy is intended to provide the board an opportunity to strategically target funding on an annual basis. And the way the board can do this is twofold. By taking a comprehensive look at housing resources through the annual budget, which is what we're doing now, and ultimately adopting those funding allocations for housing through the RDA's annual budget. And then new for this upcoming fiscal year, by adopting a funding priorities resolution for the next fiscal year. So last time we focused a little bit on the funding priorities, and today, since we're talking about the larger budget, it may behoove us to focus more on the budget allocations. There are 4 funds which are displayed here. The Housing Development Fund, which is comprised of Funding Our Future funding, the Primary Housing Fund, which is the mandatory set aside for affordable housing, Secondary Housing Fund, which is discretionary tax increment for affordable housing, and then Northwest Quadrant Housing Fund, which is that inland port tax differential. The board has authority to adjust these recommended allocation amounts or add new projects and programs to fund. But what the RDA administration has proposed through the budget is that the bulk of it go through the Housing Development Loan Program to a citywide housing NOFA. That would be about $3.5 million worth. $1 million for a strategic property acquisition, and $250,000 for an ADU program. The board also has the authority to provide legislative intent to further define how these funds may be used. So for example, a set aside of the Housing Development Loan Program could be identified for a specific project area, say North Temple, as I know that is a priority for the board. Or the strategic acquisition funds could be also identified for a specific geographic area or for a specific type of project. Based on the board's discussion during the last meeting, we heard that the board does not want to use the $250,000 from the Northwest Quadrant Housing Fund for an ADU program, but rather have RDA staff return with a structure for utilizing the funding for a community land trust or a urban wealth fund type program. We also heard that you may be interested in increasing the amount allocated for that strategic property acquisition. RDA staff realizes $1 million is not enough to purchase a property of a significant size, but we were strategizing that funds could also be used, say, from the North Temple catalytic pot of money or other sources and be leveraged with this $1 million set aside. But the board could increase that amount if they wish. And then also we heard that you would like to have further discussion on the funding strategies that will ultimately be put out with the Housing Development Loan Program, NOFAs. So that's a summary of where we're at on housing. But continuing with our overall budget presentation, I'll pass it back off to Danny. And this slide might be slightly out of order. Or no, it's not, Danny. We're talking about CBD. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, before we jump into that, I just want to thank Tammy and Danny for, we went back to that past slide, looking at the Northwest Quadrant money and looking at that Urban Wealth Fund or the Urban Land Fund. So I appreciate them working hard and whomever else was on that, but also wanted to make sure that when they do come back that we identify that in policy so that it is set in stone for that. So that use. And just again, thanks Danny and Tammy for all your hard work. Sorry for springing that on you last minute, that last meeting. I thought that I was holding it close to the vest, but I really appreciate it because this is exactly what I wanted to see happen.
Thank you. And yeah, we absolutely look forward to continuing that conversation and understanding better how you'd like to roll that out. So we can certainly return with that. The next slide is a breakdown of the Central Business District Fund. This is one just because of the size. We like to provide a little bit of breakdown because when you look at the total budget of just under $28 million, it's always been helpful to inform the board and the public of exactly how that works out. So as the agency receives that $27.9 million, 16.5 of that is turned around and reimbursed back to the taxing entities, and that's strictly a function of the approval of the CBD extension several years ago and sharing in the growth of that increment. We then have a few reimbursement agreements within the project area that are just under 1.5 million. And then we also make a sizable contribution to the Eccles Theater project directly from the Central Business District project area of just under 5 million to help pay that debt service. And then in addition, we have the allocation of administration, operations, and maintenance. And that's everything, like I said, from our admin costs to the costs of, providing services and managing Gallivan Center to also the maintenance of properties, as well as other contractual obligations or just functions of operations. And so out of that, just under $28 million for all of CBD within fiscal year 22, that leaves a hefty amount of $83,832 for projects. So I think you can see as a board why we provide that slide, because that's a fairly sobering breakdown of what those obligations are for payments. So next section is actually going into the meat of the budget. And rather than boring you with every fund breakdown, keeping in the spirit of overall presentation of the annual budget, we want to focus on the key changes within the funds and what impacts our budget overall. So the first one to mention is just our overall tax increment projection. And again, we're fairly conservative in carrying that over 2% of what we projected in fiscal year 21. And again, as you just saw with budget amendment 1, that came in more conservative than what we actually received. but we build 2% off of that original conservative estimate from last year's budget, not 2% over what we actually received. So we kind of continue that nature of kind of under projecting what we anticipate to receive, and that's just to ensure that we have that coverage. The exception here is that in Central Business District, we did increase the projection for 10%. And this is a function because we have seen a rebounding in Central Business District to where we're comfortable, at least this year, bumping that up a little bit more based on what we've actually received. However, we're still extremely conservative versus what we actually get in payments versus what's in the budget. So that's just the overall funds in nature. And then getting into the specific funds, the first one being Central Business District. The key changes within this entire fund are there is an increase of $50,000 for Gallivan programming. This line item is specific to the contract we have with Excellence in the Community. They have done an amazing job over the past year and through the pandemic of expanding their audience with live streaming. And they did that not just for the concert that they provide, but also for 2 concerts a week that we provide with them, as well as that they oversee. And so this 50,000 increase is a function of paying a small amount of what that will take to continue that live streaming after the pandemic. And they have charged themselves with doing the fundraising for the balance of it. But we felt that as an agency and Gallivan staff, that has been a tremendous way to get that event out to a broader audience worldwide through YouTube and through the different channels. And so this was an increase for that line item. The final 83,832 that I spoke about would be as part of a program that Tammy mentioned, also part of our larger commercial loan program, updating and revamping, but trying to focus this within the downtown area specifically for storefront commercial revitalization. And then within our budget, we still obviously have the funds for West Capitol Hill and West Temple Gateway. Both these project areas have expired. We do not collect any revenue or increment from it. However, we do at least allocate the interest earnings from these funds to the administration expense. And that interest is earned off of 2 capital projects that we are wrapping up within those project areas. Within West Temple Gateway, that's the 900 South Streetscape project. And then within West Capitol Hill, that's the 300 West Streetscape project. So both those projects are out to bid or working through the bid process right now. And so we anticipate those moving forward soon, but that's why we still show them within our budget.
All right, moving on to the Depot District. We are proposing 2 projects with the discretionary funds, adding an additional $330,000 to Station Center infrastructure. This is the infrastructure amount that Ben reviewed during the Budget Amendment 1 item. $11 million has been allocated and there's still a funding gap, and this will be for city-owned streets and will facilitate the redevelopment of Station Center. We're also proposing $200,000 for environmental remediation needs for Station Center. There's a minor amount of contamination within the land there, and we have requested and the board has allocated this amount in the past, but this year we are earmarking those funds as a capital project so they will revolve in nature and not drop to fund balance. In the Granary District, we are requesting that the balance of the discretionary funds, almost $450,000, be allocated to that community cultural initiative program that we spoke about earlier in the presentation. And on North Temple, we're requesting that the balance of the discretionary funds, about $290,000, be allocated to the catalytic project pot of funds.
The Block 70 project area, as we mentioned, this is heavily subsidized by the Central Business District contributions from that project area. Really no significant key changes outside of our obligations or availability of discretionary funds, but one of the changes you will see in that budget is that we have transferred the insurance costs that we were originally funding through the agency, and that has now been turned over to the overall operations of the theater and split as part of that agreement with both the county, the city, and the agency.
And then finally, Northwest Quadrant and Stadler, we are carrying out our tax increment reimbursement obligations And then with the discretionary funds, we're projecting about 350,000. Of those, we are proposing go to a project we call shared costs. And this was built into the Northwest Quadrant CRA budget, and it's contemplated to be about 10% of the overall project area budget going to projects that benefit the larger Northwest Quadrant area. We don't have a specific project in mind, but we do know there are significant infrastructure needs within the Northwest Quadrant. So it's anticipated that a project will be identified over the upcoming years.
And then the program income fund, the board will recall this is our most flexible funding account. This is where we realize the revenue from our parking structures and other loan payoffs and revenue sources. And then we have the flexibility to expense these amounts throughout project areas or on initiatives as the board decides. So the key changes of the discretionary funds here are, again, a significant contribution to what we anticipate being an updated commercial revitalization loan program. And the idea is here is that these funds would be available to all project areas. And we obviously as staff would target those to both the 9 Line and the North Temple as kind of trying to kickstart and that area, as well as focus on efforts within North Temple as we have those funds and make them available. The other is the Sustainability Technical Assistance Program, as Tammy described earlier, in terms of providing that assistance as we roll out our sustainability measures. And then an allocation of $250,000 for Gallivan repairs. This is the continued set aside for funding for maintenance and repairs that we anticipate as one of the owners or the owner of Gallivan Center and one of the owners within the Owners Association doing these repairs so that we have funding available and start making and start doing those projects. So before I turn it over to Tammy for the last slide and discussion of housing, I forgot to mention and say thank you to our financial analyst, Erin Cunningham, within the RDA for all her work on this, as well as the financial analyst, Mike Burns in finance, who has done a tremendous job of preparing our budget for us. And so both of them, even though Tammy and I are presenting it, have done the bulk of the work to get us to this point today, and just wanted to make sure we said thank you to them. So.
And then, of course, we reviewed this on a previous slide, but the housing funds, we're proposing $1 million to a strategic site acquisition, $250,000 to the ADU program, and I think it's actually 3.5 for the housing development loan program, but 2.59 of that is coming from funding our future. And that is our presentation.
Thank you so much. That's a lot of information. That's great to know, guys. Thank you so much for the work. I'm excited to go back to that one slide. Is it okay if we have that slide up so that we can have that conversation about our priorities?
The housing slide, Madam Chair?
Yeah. That one, the one before.
And Madam Chair, just wanted to clarify something really quick, is that that housing slide references fiscal year 22 dollars. Those aren't the only dollars I think that are on the table, so to speak, for consideration for the board, because there are funds from this current fiscal year that we're in, funds from budget amendment number 1 that the board could also consider, you know, adding, adjusting, changing to these programs. That's probably summarized better in the packets in the next agenda item if the board wanted to reference those materials. But just wanted to flag that for you guys.
Thank you. All right. So Tammy, you said the housing development fund, it's not 2.5, but 3.5?
Yeah, the total, so 2.59 of it is coming from the housing development fund, which is funding our future money. But the proposed allocate, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, can you?
Yeah.
The proposed allocations are over here. So it's 3.48 for the housing development loan program, $1 million for the property acquisition, and $250,000 for the ADU program. And so through the FY22 budget, there's $4.7 million available through these 4 housing funds.
All right. So board members, do you have questions or discussions that you would like to have about this 4.732627 funds and how they've been proposed to be allocated?
Or Madam Chair, any of the budget that's proposed. I think the
Or
housing
any
is one part of it,
budget.
right? So yeah.
Or any of the budget. Let me see.
I have a question, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the Northwest Quadrant, just going back to Board Member Rogers's question from last meeting, there's the 250 for the 9-line ADU program, but the Northwest Quadrant 250 that we're seeing on this page is a different one that will stay in the community land trust. Am I understanding that right?
So to clarify, the bar graph is the source of the fund, and over here is the use, essentially. So this is the revenue source, and these are the expenses. So the revenue source is the Northwest Quadrant Fund, and the expense is this ADU program at 250,000.
Okay, but there is still the money that Board Member Rogers was concerned about for the community land trust in a separate spot. Or is that?
Well, to clarify, we have not, this is the mayor's recommended budget, the administration's budget, so we have not made any adjustments.
Okay,
From
thanks.
the last discussion, this is what was proposed through the last discussion.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. I know that was brought up and I didn't understand how it was recognized in here, so that helps me understand.
Yeah, so Madam Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
What I think James would be proposing, and James, correct me if I'm wrong, but with your conversations with Danny and Tammy, but you know how I love womansplaining, is that we take that 250,000 and instead of putting it towards an ADU program, we put it towards the urban land trust.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, you nailed it, Amy.
Madam Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
My understanding is that the accessory dwelling units program is acquired by the county, so do we then need to find a different source for the ADU program? Is that correct? And whether it's exactly 250 or some other amount? Is that something that could just come out of the general, whatever we said, 3.5?
Sorry to jump in. I think we could probably clarify with the attorney's office if that needed to be funded in this first fiscal year, because we actually haven't technically budgeted for revenue from the 9-line project area yet. And so we would essentially be implementing that ADU program early, if that makes sense, if you funded it this fiscal year, which isn't a bad thing, obviously. But
if I could clarify, I believe in the interlocal with Salt Lake County, we are to implement the program within the first 5 years of collecting tax increment. So there is time. We just wanted to get a jump start on it. And then the Northwest Quadrant Housing Funds, as I mentioned, is inland port tax differential. The 250,000 in projected revenue is based on the amount we received in this current fiscal year, but it is projected to grow quite a bit as the Northwest Quadrant builds out.
And Madam Chair,
Yeah, go ahead.
That funding for the Northwest Quadrant is earmarked for West Side housing, correct?
Correct. That's what we've been talking about.
Right.
And through the RDA Housing Allocations Fund policy that was adopted in, I think it was February, you have a policy priority for that specific fund to be utilized west of I-15.
Okay. And follow up, just back to the ADU question. We haven't specified where those that program would be situated. Did we discuss that, where the ADU program would be implemented?
Yeah, it would be in the 9-line.
Okay, just in the 9-line. Okay, thank you for the clarification.
So that's what that was one of the requirements that the county had, that we work on anti-displacement or anti-gentrification strategies for housing. I'm interested not only for housing, but also for commercial. And but now we're just talking about housing. And that was one of the proposals that administration had, to use the Northwest Quadrant 250,000 to use of the 9 line and, and implement that strategy. However, like board member Roger said, we're not interested in that money to happen there. We're interested in keeping it for other housing strategies in west of I-15. But I'm interested in this is a question for the board. I'm interested in actually doing the accessory dwelling unit program from other sources of funding. I think it's important if we could get jump started. I think it would be great to show the county that we're working on it, getting it done. So
Madam Chair,
yeah, go ahead.
I also am very interested in jumpstarting that accessory dwelling unit program. And I prefer that program be crafted in a way that it can be adapted to any part of the city. And of course, the 9 line, since we're required to do it, and since the 9 line is an ideal place for accessory dwelling units, let's start it there. But I would like however we craft the policy or the program, for it to be easily adapted and expanded to other parts of the city.
So this could be
And board members, if I could just clarify, depending on where those funds come from, you would have that flexibility to spend it beyond the 9 line as long as certain income thresholds were met with the final product.
And Madam Chair, I just want to point out also that we can put more money towards the urban land fund. It doesn't just have to be the 250K that has come from the Northwest Quadrant. If that's something we want to look at as well, and making those improvements drastically faster than waiting on allocating these funds. I think the problem is that we've noticed with our RDA project areas is that towards the end of their life cycle, that's when we really start to see that development. It's not at the beginning. And we've looking at doing catalytic projects. That's why we're looking at so much money funding towards the North Temple, and acquiring properties. But as we do this, we can, look at strategically and purposefully making those monies available to make an impact for affordable housing on the west side, and looking at that. And, I would love to see, I'm all in favor of the ADU program, specifically in the 9 line, but cost effectively, is that the biggest bang for our buck? And I'm not saying, I know we have to invest in certain areas because that's been agreed upon, but I know ADUs are certainly more expensive when putting in infrastructure for sewer and water and getting them to people's backyards or on top of their garages than it is in looking at some acquisition of property where we can turn it over, an old motel or that type of thing. So I think it'd be wise and prudent for us to look at that moving forward, because the ADUs are expensive if we're looking at per unit basis. It is a little bit more because you have to do, footings, foundation, you have to come in and do all the health safety things, but it's only for 1 unit compared to looking at multiple units.
Madam Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to piggyback a little bit on what James was just saying. Sorry, I just lost my pen. Okay, found it. And, a couple of months ago, we had a discussion about ADUs with planning, and they gave us their yearly update, if you will, their report on how many ADUs we had seen throughout the city, what some of the potential hurdles for people were. One of the things that was brought up, it was the expense of building ADUs. And once you go through finding a contractor, finding an architect, getting your permit, getting through, that it became the value of having the ADU that we were hoping for in offsetting one's mortgage or having somebody of a family member be able to live there and create this affordability became unaffordable because people were having a difficult time even just creating the ADU, so said, man, let's not do it. And one of the things that we talked about with planning was this idea of having sort of cookie cutter ADUs, right? Where you could go in, look through a book, look at your project area and say, this is what I want, already have it permitted, this sort of streamlined idea. And if we don't have to implement the ADU program in the 9 line for a couple of years, I wonder if it wouldn't be more beneficial to really work with planning on getting some of that streamlined process down so that it actually is affordable and attainable for people to build ADUs within the area. And then we're not just, I mean, I think that at that point, the money we put forward to the ADU program goes a lot further, right? Because you're not spending triple what you could spend on somebody just coming in and saying, we want an ADU, we want this money, we don't know where to start, we're going to expend all of this money on things that we maybe wouldn't need to if the city had a more streamlined, that we have already talked with planning about. So for me, and I think this goes back also to Darren's point, is that if we're going to create a model that could be used throughout the city, that we should probably start with the foundation of the model. And the foundation of the model, in my opinion, isn't just giving money to something, it's making sure the process is there so people can actually attain what they want to attain, and our money can go a little bit further.
I can see that. Having this streamlined process, it's something that I think it's like an unattainable thing that we can do, that planning can do. But I am thinking what Board Member Rogers said, the cost of construction and the connections is what will be the most expensive thing at this point, in time. And so how do we, so going back, so these are all like the technical things, are the things that step by step so that something like this happens. But I think we need to keep in mind how we're going to accomplish display or anti-gentrification in this area. And the time keeps moving, right? Like things are super hot in the market right now. People are buying and selling, and people might be getting priced out where they live. And so how can we be fast somewhat, or try to help like now before it's too late, when let's say we figure this out in 4 years or in 3 years, and then it's kind of like not relevant anymore because people have been priced out. So that's a struggle I have. I can see what you guys are saying, but also I don't delaying things. It's also a problem for me.
Madam Chair,
Yeah, go ahead.
may I chime in? And I think just to help clarify some of our obligations, as Tammy mentioned, we do obviously have that obligation within the interlocal for 9-line. That's not to say that necessarily this program has to be a burden or overcomplicated or even, absorb a significant amount of funding. I mean, at least within this initial year, the board could obviously direct us as staff to start working on the program and have an idea of what it might take or require, or what the ideal funding might be in the future. And we can certainly do that in conjunction with planning and other city departments. But I think rather than get too far in the weeds, we can start working on that, and then we can identify what that funding need is in conjunction with what the board and your priorities are for how much you may or may not want to put towards it. But I don't think it needs to be over complicated. And I think to the point of the annual housing funding strategy, that is what this conversation could become as part of that. To Director Rogers' comment of like, where would we get the biggest bang for our buck? What would we see as results for funding that versus other projects? And those are, that's the information that we would anticipate continuing to bring to the board that could inform ultimately in the future what level of funding you would want to put towards that program. But I think right now we still probably have a lot of work that we could get started on just crafting what that might be structured as. So,
Okay.
Madam Chair,
Yeah,
may
go
I?
ahead.
I know recognize I'm new to this discussion, but if I understand correctly, we've got up to 5 years to make a streamlined program work and can use this as a pilot project across the city. Also, regarding James, Councilmember Rogers' concerns about bang for the buck, I agree with him completely, but there must be multiple solutions to take care of people in different situations. So something like an ADU program can help someone create an extra income stream to maintain the space that they are currently living in, to stay there rather than being forced to move into some place just because it's cheaper. And I would love to be able to see that as a anti-displacement tool more so than simply providing cheaper, smaller places. So I think both can be achieved. So yeah, we certainly have to be considerate of bang for the buck, but we need more than one option too.
Thank you. Great point.
Madam Chair, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, we could also come back with just a policy for right now that just involved the 9 line that said we have to put 10% of the tax increment into affordable housing, and we have this obligation with the ADUs. So like when we're talking about what the funding would be, Danny, you could essentially say a percentage of the 10% would need to go into this ADU program.
Yes, you could set it as a percentage, a set amount, or variable.
Okay. That's all for me.
Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
I think what Danny suggested is I would like that to happen, that the staff starts to think about what the program, gather some research, think about what the program might be. I'll just make a comment that I'm not entirely opposed to the idea, but I do have some concerns about cookie cutter plans, just with the sense of, I think every site condition is different. And so we need to make sure that we have enough variety in the plans. And of course, this is coming from my bias as an architect, but we need to have some variety in the plan so that not everything, so that the plans can be chosen to respond to local site conditions, and so that we don't have a whole bunch of a whole bunch of the exact same thing over and over and over. It doesn't look like a typical suburb in the, with a mass development. So I think that making the process faster and simpler is important, but just keeping in mind that
Board member Mono does not want to see tough sheds. He doesn't want to see tough sheds everywhere.
Want to see the exact same thing repeated on every single alley.
Right. I
He
get
wants
that.
to see honest buildings.
I don't think anyone does. I think the idea from planning was that if you wanted something, you had the ability to come in and pick something instead of hire an architect. So it became a little bit more feasible for people to actually do.
Okay.
Madam Chair,
Yeah, go ahead.
I like the discussion on the ADUs, but we have the idea about a quick discussion on the priority side of the house, on the bigger
Yes.
priority side of the house. And what we have the one staff report, and there's 13 listed 13 different priorities. And Danny, maybe we could take a look at those 13, maybe give us what's your top 3, top 5, and how you would break down the funding incentives to go along with those, and how you would have one that are just you got to give it to us. There's a it's a ticket into the door. You have to have this ticket before you even get anywhere on a funding incentive, a interest rate incentive. So look at that and tell us what would be the best priorities so we can go forward, because the ADUs are great, but we got to look at family housing. We got to look at the missing middle, home ownership. All has to be applied and looked at. So I would appreciate if we would focus on that in the upcoming weeks.
We can absolutely provide additional information on that, because I think it's very important to clarify for the board's benefit, as well as new director Ferris, in terms of how that works, both within how you as a board would like us to target those funds, both in terms of location within the city, as well as when we put those out on the street to developers, what are those priorities that you would like to focus on? And so if that's paring that list down from 13 to 5 to 7, just making up numbers, as well as if there are some that you want to have be minimum thresholds. We certainly can do that, as well as provide information on some of the recent loans that you have approved and how many metrics have been included in that, so that you can kind of see what developers have hit in terms of those marks. And then also understand that the Housing Development Fund and what we call NOFA, which is our Notice of Funding Availability, are kind of the same thing. That's our annual allocation and putting out to the public and the developers for what's available. One of the main reasons we do that is because it is a competitive basis that they apply for. So obviously, within that extent, developers are encouraged to try to hit as many of those as possible. And then we are able as staff to rank those based on how they hit the marks of what your priorities are. And then you as a board are able to approve and finalize those terms. And so if you feel that maybe we were too generous in allocating some of those, you can always change that as part of the loan approval too. But to your point, Director Dugan, we can certainly provide that additional information to the board and have a more in-depth conversation on that.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Danny. And Madam Chair, one more question. A little change of subject here, or not change of subject because it's still on the budget. We have the Depot District tax increment is expiring next fiscal year. And that's a good chunk of your admin fees or admin revenue. Are you guys already projecting on what's going to replace that, or does that when that goes away, does your admin burden go down by the equal amount? Because we're going to be losing that tax increment to fund our admin.
That is a hit that we have to take into account, and then we have, at least at a high level, started considering how we were going to do that as far as how to cover that gap both with Depot and then Granary, not as much the following year, but that's part of the conversation we're having with finance and internally of how we identify sources for that and how that then gets carried.
Because the Northwest Quadrant wouldn't be able to fill that same hole.
Not yet, no. Our newer project areas have not ramped up to that point yet to fully fill that gap.
If I may add, we do have a significant project coming online in the Northwest Quadrant within this calendar year. It's the Northwest Quadrant Phase 1 development, which the board provided a tax increment reimbursement to. So that should help a little bit.
Great. Board members, we have a couple more minutes. If we can continue talking about, if you have something that you want to say about the housing priorities that you didn't say last time or today, now is the time. We'll have more opportunities, but I would like to keep moving on with today's meetings. We have an appointee that we need to interview, and we have a closed session. So let me move my. So here, does anybody have anything?
Madam Chair?
Okay, here, yeah.
I just have a question, and I can take the answer offline or in a future meeting, but we've talked a lot about our future goals for 9 Line and North Temple, and I haven't heard much about the State Street project area, or if that's when we expect that will be fully adopted by other taxing entities. So I just would, maybe an email or something would be fine for time's sake, but I'd like some updates on that.
Thank you. Danny, would you mind sending, I guess, the whole board a little update on the State Street one?
We can certainly do that, yes.
Perfect, thank you. All right, I'm going to scroll and see if anybody else has their hand up for this discussion today. Okay, I don't see anybody. So I appreciate all of the comments and the discussion. I'm excited to keep talking about it and keep those numbers in mind, and also the priorities for housing, and any other questions that you have for the budget, about the budget allocations for the different districts for next time. We're moving on to item number 5, which is a board appointment of Nicholas Peterson to the REC, to the Redevelopment Advisory Committee. He's being considered for a term ending May 18th, 2025. Do we have Nick here?
Yes,
All
I
right.
am here.
Welcome.
Hello, Anna,
Hi, how are you?
Councilwoman. This is the same Nick Peterson that you work with at the DCC, Downtown Community Council.
All right.
And I'm sorry, I don't see that my video is working. I went through the test process this morning. Can you all see me?
No.
You are absolutely the most fortunate people on the planet.
I don't think so.
I went through the
Okay.
whole testing process. It's wonderful to be here. I'd like to thank everyone for the consideration today, and I look forward to moving through the process.
Right, Nick. Thank you so much for considering, and serving at in this board. Board members, is there anything else you would like to know about Nick? Any questions? Any comments? Go ahead, Chris.
Yes, thank you, Nick, for applying and being willing to serve. What do you think that you bring most as an applicant to the RAC, and what do you hope to gain out of your experience and your contributions?
Thank you, Chris. That's a great question. And I bring a lot of organizational experience, not just on a community side, but also on a corporate side. I've spent the last 25 years running a large organization, large healthcare organization, and decided to finally downsize back to just one location. And my husband and I chose Salt Lake City because we always loved this place. And we both see a lot of opportunity in Salt Lake. And I see what I can give to this particular board is some skills that I've developed over the years. I helped to redevelop an area of Tampa called Tampa Heights. Got in on the ground floor when I was in my early 20s, or I should say late 20s, and didn't know what I didn't know. And restored an old Victorian there, and at the same time learned a lot about redevelopment the way it should happen, meaning helping homeowners stay in their homes, not creating the downtown West Palm Beach dynamic. I grew up in Palm Beach County, so I read that case study. We've got we've got so much opportunity here to turn Salt Lake City into the next Prague if we want to. It just needs the vision, and we need what I was just listening to about affordable dwelling units and accessory dwelling units and affordable housing. These are all keys to making sure that our city doesn't turn into that we don't suffer from some of the unintended consequences of development.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's great. Anybody else? Okay, I don't see anybody else. It's a question for you, Nick. We're going to proceed with our meeting, and then we are going to take a vote on you. And I wanted to make a clarification, and I will make it later, that the term would end January 20th of 2025, not May 18th. As
Okay.
I said. Okay.
Thank you. All right, I appreciate that. Should I just exit the meeting now?
Yes, you may, or you may stay, whatever you like.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Folks, we're moving on to report and announcements from the executive director. Do we have the mayor here? She is at the meeting, but she may not be available at this time. Danny, correct?
Yes, we do not have any reports at this time, Madam Chair. Thank you.
From the executive director. What about RDA staff?
Neither one, as far as I'm aware. I've not been told otherwise. Thank you.
So we have no written briefings. We're moving on to the consent part, and we are considering approving Nicholas Peterson to the Redevelopment Advisory Committee for a term ending January 20th, 2025. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Right, we have a motion by Chris Wharton and a second by Darren Mano. Was it Dan Dugan? All right, I'm gonna roll call this. Rogers?
Yes.
Perez?
abstained. Just wasn't around for all the discussion prior to this.
Right. Wharton,
Yes.
Mano,
Yes.
Dugan,
Yes.
Fowler,
Yes.
and I'm a yes. Perez abstained. All right. So we have a closed session scheduled for strategy sessions to discuss the purchase, exchange, or lease of real property and advice of counsel. A friendly reminder to everybody to be sure they're in a closed area in a room by themselves during the closed session. And I need a motion actually to exit this meeting and go into a closed session.
Madam Chair, I move that we exit the meeting and go into a closed session for the purpose of discussing acquisition of real property and for advice of counsel.
Second.
Right, I have a motion by Chris Wharton and a second by Fowler. And I'm going to roll call this. Rogers.
Yes.
Ferris.
Yes.
Wharton.
Yes.
Mano.
Yes.
Fowler.
Yes.
Dugan.
Yes.
And I'm a yes.
And Madam
Madam
Chair,
Chair?
just to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Councilmember Rogers.
I was just going to clarify that my invitation says it's a closed session for Salt Lake City Council. Is that actually meant for RDA?
So we're actually going to be staying in this link because this was sort of a last minute addition to closed sessions for today. And then we'll just invite anyone who's not supposed to be in the closed session to exit the meeting, and we'll lock the meeting once all those people have left. One other clarification for the public is that you will be adjourned as the RDA at the conclusion of your closed session, and will convene as the council.
Thank you.
In your next meeting.
And we're scheduled to convene around 4 o'clock, right, Jen?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks, Lehua.
Also, don't lose the council closed session link because we will use that probably over the dinner break. So the one James had is still necessary for later.
So we'll just give it a minute for